So now that we have our system for measuring the distance between the corner of the mouth and a particular location on the side of the face, we're going to set up a secondary deformer, a cluster, to add additional deformation to this side lip movement. So let's look at what we have with the standard skin cluster weighting. It's going back pretty far. But I'm going to add a cluster to push this area back a little further and then do a little volume preservation here, bulging this out. Okay, so I'm going to start by creating the cluster. I'm going to select the mesh and use the Edit Paint Selection tool to select the vertices. So Edit, Paint Selection tool. So determining the boundaries of this cluster. Okay, I'm going to push it pretty far back, include a fairly broad area on this character's face. Okay, so there's the extent of the cluster. So with those verts selected, I'm going to select Deform, Create Cluster, and open the option box. And make sure that our cluster is set to relative. Once again, this is something that you could change after the fact, but we'll just do it now in this lesson here. Okay, so we've created that cluster. Now I'm going to quickly create a locator, create locator, give that locator a name. Okay, so I'm going to parent the locator to the cluster. Let's change that. I'm going to point constrain the locator to the cluster. So select the cluster first, shift select the locator, and then select constrain point. Show our locators again, so we can delete that point constraint. So now the locator is sitting right on top of the cluster. So since I'm going to use scaling to add volume to the side of the mouth here, I'm going to zero out the translate X on the locator. So now it sits right in the center of the mouth, so the scaling will come from the center of the mouth cavity. And the reason being is I'm going to replace the cluster handle with this locator. I'll do that by selecting the cluster and opening the attribute editor, then clicking on the cluster 1 handle shape node, then toggling down the weighted node frame, and then typing in the name of the locator. Okay, so now once again this cluster handle has no effect since the cluster deformations are no longer tied to these transformations, so I can delete it. But this locator here drives all the cluster deformations. So I'm going to parent this to the first head joint. Then quickly change the deformation order on the head. I'm going to select the head, then click on the inputs to selected object, and left mouse click and select all inputs. I'm going to reorder the cluster beneath the skin cluster. Quickly rename this. Okay, so now I'm going to paint the fall off for this cluster. Click on the head, and I could either select Deform, Paint Cluster Weight Tools in the option box, or I could right mouse click on the mesh and then select Paint, Cluster, and then select the appropriate cluster. And you have to double click to open up the tool setting. I'm going to change my brush to solid and 100. My operation to replace, and go in and start tapering these weights. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to paint this to 0.1 on both of the ends, and work from both ends inward. Once again, this is just a rough first pass. Go up to 0.2. 0.4. Very rough weighting here. So once I'm past the 0.1 weighting, I'm increasing the weight in increments of 2% or 0.2, 20% rather. Then in the end, I'll go from 0.8 to 0.9. Okay. Okay, so you can see this group node is a little off in space here. So I am actually going to unparent the locator, zero out the group node, let's try point constraining this. Now I'm going to reparent this cluster locator. We're still getting transforms on that. Just trying to zero out that locator. Okay, let's look at the deformations we have. Still pretty rough. So what I'm going to do is we're going to tie the transformations on this locator to the distance dimension node. So with the cluster locator selected, I'm going to select Animate, Set Driven Key, Set, and Option Box. Sometimes you'll see me fumbling with these menus because I'm used to using hotkeys and marquee menus, but for these lessons I'll go through the menus here. So I'm going to select all the transforms. Now I'm going to select the distance dimension node and then hit the down arrow once so that we have the shape node of the distance dimension selected, and load that into the driver of the set driven key menu. Scroll all the way to the bottom until we have distance. I'm going to keyframe this at their default values. I'll scroll to the maximum extent of this side controller, which compresses the distance dimension node. You can see that value shrinking there. Let's select our cluster and move it into place. Let's move this out of the way. So I'm going to move it back some, just a little. Then do some scaling. Okay. Let's key these values so we can close our set driven key. Okay, so if we look at the opposite side, which has the exact same skin cluster, you can already see a different behavior. We focus in on this area. Okay, so at this point I'm going to adjust the weight map of the cluster. I'm going to select the mesh and select Deform, Paint Cluster Weights tool, and switch my brush to the soft brush, lower the weight, the opacity value, change the operation to add, then lower my value to say 0.125. Grab the Wacom tablet and start adjusting these weights. Let's move this to the side. A little more real estate. Okay, next we're going to switch this opacity to 0.05. My value to 0, and then my operation to replace. I'm going to subtract weighting from this cluster in certain areas to sort of pull it back. So by using the replace of 0 at a very low weight value, I'm subtracting influence from the cluster. I'm going to plow through this pretty quickly. Let's try not to spend too much time on the cluster weighting. Just get it to a point where it's not overly distracting as I try and complete the demo. Okay, it's going to go in and adjust our cluster a bit. So I have the cluster locator selected. I'm going to select Window, Animation Editor's Graph Editor. That's going to allow me to go in and edit what I'm doing with the set-driven key curves. I'm going to delete these rotation curves. Focus on just the curves that I have animated. Okay. Something I'm going to increase the scale X. I'm using the translate manipulator. Okay, another thing I'm going to do, I'm going to try delaying the translation and scale of this cluster here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is when this lip handle compresses to about 0.25 or 2.5, then I'm going to kick in the cluster transformation. So here we can see the lip is compressing. And so there's a delayed cluster transformation. What I'm trying to simulate with that is a gradual buildup of mass or flesh in the upper part of the lip, which will start in a cascading motion, compressing further back in the face. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unlock my tangent weights. Select these. Okay, first let me change these to a weighted curve, and then unlock these tangents. What I'm going to do now is just stretch out these tangents so that the ease in is a lot longer. Okay, just as a 2.75. Okay, a little slight delay there. Starts to compress the mass, and then you can see the clusters start to kick in. Once again, this weighting is a little rough, but if we compare the two sides here, I'm going to split the window real quick. Create a new perspective. Okay, so here we can see both sides of the face. So here we can see the difference with that distance-based deformation. Once again, this cluster weighting is a bit rough, but you can see the difference that you can get. And then you can also, because it's a secondary deformer, something not based on the skin cluster, you can actually change the timing of when that kicks in. If this were all skin cluster weighting, it would have to be tied in with the skin cluster deformations. This could be used all throughout the face, adding a secondary deformation. Once again, we're not getting into a cycle because we're using a distance measure based on a patch that, while it gets the skin cluster information, is not a face actually tied to this, so that this deformation isn't putting us into a deformation cycle. Okay, a little quick example of tying a distance-based deformation using a cluster, and then with the set driven key, slightly changing the timing so we can get a more organic feel. Once again, this is a fairly rough example, but hopefully a clear example to show how this can be used in various parts of the face as well as other parts of the body of your character.